The Man Who Waited at the Station Every Night, 1884. Before we begin tonight's journey, settle into a comfortable position. Let your shoulders relax. Take a slow, gentle breath, and allow the sounds of the day to fade away. Tonight, we are traveling back in time to the American frontier. The year is 1884. The Great Western Railroads stretch across endless prairies. Small wooden towns sit quietly beneath wide skies. Steam locomotives connect distant families, carry letters across thousands of miles, and bring news from places that many people will never see. Far from the crowded streets of New York, Chicago, or Boston, there is a forgotten railway station standing alone in the open grasslands. Its name is Ash Creek Station. It is a simple building made of weathered pine wood. A small ticket window faces the tracks. A cast-iron stove warms the waiting room during the long winters. Outside, two wooden benches rest beneath a faded station sign that has slowly lost its paint after years of wind, rain, and summer sun. Only 3 trains stop here each day. The first arrives shortly after sunrise. The second passes quietly during the afternoon. The last train comes just after sunset. When that final train disappears into the darkness, silence returns to the prairie. Only the wind remains. Every evening, just before the sun slips below the horizon, someone appears on the dusty road leading toward the station. He never arrives early. He never arrives late. His timing is always exactly the same. He is an elderly man. His brown coat has clearly seen many winters. His black felt hat is carefully brushed every morning, despite its age. In one hand, he carries a small leather bag that looks almost as old as the station itself. His steps are slow, but steady. He walks to the northern bench without saying a word. Then he sits. And he waits. The station workers notice him every day. The passengers notice him. Even children, passing through with their parents, quietly point toward the lonely old man who never boards a train. No one knows his name. No one knows where he lives. No one has ever seen anyone waiting for him. Yet every evening, he returns. Some people whisper that he is waiting for a son who left for the Western Territories years ago. Others believe he once served in the Civil War and never truly returned home. A few claim that he simply cannot let go of the past. But no one knows the truth. The station master, Samuel Carter, has only recently arrived in Ash Creek. He is 34 years old, careful with his work, and naturally curious. For nearly 2 weeks, he watches the old man from the station office. Every evening, the same bench, the same quiet face, the same patient eyes fixed upon the railroad tracks. Finally, on a cool October evening, Samuel decides to ask the question that everyone else has been too polite to ask. He walks slowly across the wooden platform. The lanterns hanging outside the station sway gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote calls across the prairie. Samuel removes his cap. "Good evening, sir." The old man nods politely. "Good evening." Samuel smiles gently. "I hope you don't mind my asking." The old man turns toward him. "But why do you come here every single evening?" For several long moments, the old man says nothing. The only sound is the wind moving through the tall prairie grass. Finally, he speaks. "Because someone made me a promise." Samuel waits quietly. The old man continues. "He promised that one day he would come back on this railway." Samuel glances toward the empty tracks. "How long ago was that?" The old man's eyes remain fixed on the horizon. His answer is almost a whisper. 17 years. Samuel feels a chill that has nothing to do with the autumn air. 17 years. An entire generation. Yet this man has returned every evening without fail. The station clock begins to strike 8. 1, 2, 3. The final bell echoes across the mysterious whistle drifted across the prairie one final time. Then, silence. Not the ordinary silence that follows the passing of a train. This silence felt different. It was deep, almost as if the entire landscape had paused to listen. Samuel Carter remained standing on the wooden platform, staring into the darkness beyond the tracks. There was nothing. No glowing lantern on the front of a locomotive. No clouds of steam. No rumbling wheels. Nothing except the endless prairie stretching beneath a sky filled with stars. Slowly, he turned toward the old man. The faint smile had disappeared. The old man lowered his head and quietly picked up his worn leather bag. "I suppose," he said softly, "not tonight." Without another word, he walked away into the darkness, following the same dusty road he had traveled every evening for years. Samuel watched until the old man's figure faded into the night. He could not sleep. Long after midnight, he sat alone inside the station office. The small cast-iron stove crackled gently. A kerosene lamp cast warm golden light across the room. Outside, the prairie wind brushed against the wooden walls. Samuel kept thinking about the old man's words. 17 years. Who could inspire someone to wait for 17 years? The next morning, before the first train arrived, Samuel unlocked a storage room at the back of the station. Few people ever entered that room. Dust covered everything. Spider webs hung between old wooden shelves. Against the far wall stood a heavy oak cabinet filled with forgotten station records. Samuel carefully opened the lowest drawer. Inside were dozens of leather-bound ledgers. Some were so old that the pages had turned yellow with age. One by one, he placed them on the desk. Hours passed. Most of the records contained nothing more than freight deliveries, ticket sales, weather reports, and train schedules. Then, he found a ledger dated 1867. The leather cover was cracked. Several pages were loose. As Samuel slowly turned the fragile paper, one name caught his attention. Edward Harris. Beside the name, someone had written only a single sentence. Departed westbound. Promised to return. That was all. No destination. No explanation. No date of return. Nothing. Samuel frowned. It seemed strange that such a short note had been preserved for so many years. As he examined the page more closely, something slipped from between the old papers. A folded envelope. The paper had become thin with age. Across the front, written in faded black ink, were the words, "To be opened only if Edward never returns." Samuel felt his heartbeat quicken. He looked toward the station window. Morning sunlight filled the platform outside. Passengers were beginning to arrive. The station was slowly coming to life. Yet, somehow, the little envelope in his hands felt more important than everything happening outside. He hesitated. Should he open it? Or should it remain sealed forever, exactly as its writer had intended? Samuel gently placed the envelope back inside the ledger. Some stories, he believed, deserved patience. But deep inside, he already knew that before long, curiosity would overcome caution. And somewhere, beyond the rolling grasslands of the American frontier, the answer to a 17-year-old promise was still waiting to be discovered. To be continued. Part 3, Sleeping History. The morning passed quietly at Ash Creek Station. The first train arrived just after sunrise, carrying a handful of travelers, 2 wooden crates of apples, several sacks of flour, and a young schoolteacher who had come to begin a new life in the nearby town. By noon, the station had become silent once again. Samuel Carter glanced toward the old oak cabinet. The leather ledger from 1867 still rested on his desk. Inside it lay the mysterious envelope. Its faded ink seemed to whisper a forgotten story. He told himself he should leave it alone. It did not belong to him. But the question would not leave his mind. Who was Edward Harris? Why had someone written, "To be opened only if Edward never returns"? And why had no one opened it in 17 long years? The station clock ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Finally, Samuel reached for the envelope. His fingers hesitated for a moment. Then, with great care, he broke the brittle wax seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, graceful, and surprisingly easy to read despite its age. At the top of the page were the words, May 3rd, 1867. Samuel began to read. If these words are being read, then it means Edward never found his way home. If that is true, I ask only one thing of the person holding this letter. Please tell my father that I never forgot my promise. Samuel stopped reading. A quiet sadness settled over the little station office. He continued, "When I boarded the westbound train this morning, Father stood on the platform pretending to smile. I knew he was afraid. He believed the West would change me forever. Perhaps he was right. But I promised him something before the train departed. I promised that no matter how long it took, I would return to this very station." Samuel lowered the letter. Outside, a warm breeze moved gently across the prairie. He looked through the station window. The northern bench was empty, but in his imagination, he could almost see a younger man standing there beside his father. One leaving, one staying behind, both believing they would soon meet again. He returned to the letter. "If I fail to return, it will not be because I chose another life. It will be because fate carried me somewhere beyond my control. Please do not allow my father to spend the rest of his days believing that I broke my word." Samuel closed his eyes. At last, he understood. The old man who waited every evening was Edward's father. For 17 years, he had believed that one more train might finally bring his son home. Not because he ignored reality, but because he trusted a promise. Samuel carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. That evening, as the sun began to sink below the endless prairie, he stepped outside onto the platform. Right on time, the old man appeared once again. His slow footsteps echoed softly across the weathered wooden boards. He took his usual seat on the northern bench. Samuel watched him for several moments. Then he quietly walked over. This time, he carried the old envelope in his hand. The old man looked at it. His expression changed instantly. His hands trembled. In almost a whisper, he asked, "Where did you find that?" Samuel took a slow breath. "I think," he said gently, "it's time you finally knew what your son wanted to tell you." The old man's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in 17 years, the waiting was about to change. To be continued. Part 4, Sleeping History. The evening sky above Ash Creek slowly turned from soft gold to deep shades of blue. A cool breeze drifted across the prairie, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant pine trees. The station lanterns had just been lit, and their warm glow reflected gently on the old wooden platform. Samuel Carter stood quietly beside the elderly man. In his hands rested the faded envelope that had remained unopened for 17 years. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The old man stared at the familiar handwriting on the front of the envelope. His weathered fingers slowly traced each letter. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I know this handwriting." His voice trembled. "It belongs to my son." Samuel carefully handed him the letter. The old man held it as though it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. For several minutes, he simply looked at it. He was afraid to open it. Not because he feared what it might say, but because, once he read it, there would be no more wondering, no more imagining, only the truth. Finally, with a deep breath, he unfolded the fragile paper. The station became completely silent. Even the prairie wind seemed to slow. His tired eyes moved slowly across the first lines. As he read, tears quietly gathered beneath his eyelids. A small smile appeared. Then another tear rolled gently down his face. Samuel looked away, giving the old man the privacy he deserved. Several minutes passed before the letter slipped gently onto his lap. "He kept his promise," the old man whispered. "He never forgot." Those simple words carried the weight of 17 long years. Samuel sat beside him. Neither man felt the need to speak. Sometimes, silence tells a story that words cannot. After a while, The old man looked toward the dark railroad tracks stretching into the endless distance. "My name," he said softly, "is William Harris. It has been many years since anyone asked." Samuel smiled kindly. "It is an honor to meet you, Mr. Harris." William nodded. "My son was 22 when he left. He dreamed of the Western Mountains. He believed there were opportunities waiting beyond the horizon. He promised he would earn enough money to build us a proper home." William laughed quietly. "He even promised your station would be the very first place he visited when he returned." His smile slowly faded, but the years kept passing. Letters stopped coming. The railroad expanded. People moved away. The world changed. Everyone eventually told me to stop waiting. He looked once more at the letter. "But a father's heart doesn't follow calendars." The two men sat together beneath the stars. Then William reached inside his old leather bag. From the very bottom, he carefully removed a small silver pocket watch. The metal had become dull with age. The glass was scratched, but it was still ticking. Tick, tick, tick. William gently opened the cover. Inside was a tiny photograph. A young man smiled proudly into the camera. "This was Edward," William said. "He gave me this watch the morning he left. He told me." William's voice became almost too quiet to hear. "Father, if I'm ever late, keep this watch running until I come home." Samuel felt a lump form in his throat. For 17 years, William had wound the watch every single morning. Not once had he allowed it to stop. It had become more than a timepiece. It had become hope itself. Just then, a strong gust of wind swept across the station platform. The lantern flames flickered wildly. The old station sign creaked. Somewhere far beyond the darkness, a train whistle echoed once again. Long, low, and strangely familiar. William slowly stood. His eyes searched the empty tracks. This time, Samuel heard it clearly too. There was no doubt. Someone, or something, had sounded a locomotive whistle. But according to every railway schedule, no train was due. Part 5, Sleeping History. The small white light remained motionless on the horizon. Samuel Carter narrowed his eyes. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was simply a lantern carried by a traveler crossing the prairie at night. But something felt unusual. The light was perfectly steady. It neither moved closer nor drifted away. It simply waited. Beside him, William Harris held the silver pocket watch tightly in his hands. Its gentle ticking seemed louder than ever. Tick, tick, tick. The cold October wind swept across the empty platform. Above them, thousands of stars stretched across the endless American sky. Without electric lights to dim the heavens, every constellation shone with remarkable clarity. Samuel had worked on the railroad for nearly 15 years. He knew every scheduled train, every freight route, every passenger line. No locomotive should have been anywhere near Ash Creek at this hour. Yet the whistle they had heard was unmistakable. Steam locomotives had a voice unlike anything else. No man who worked for the railroad could mistake it. After several long minutes, the mysterious light slowly disappeared. It did not fade. It did not move. It simply vanished. William let out a quiet breath. "It does that sometimes," he whispered. Samuel looked at him in surprise. "You've seen it before?" William nodded. "Many times. I never told anyone. They would have called me an old fool." Samuel remained silent. William continued. "The first time was about 10 years after Edward left. I thought it was his train. So I waited all night. But the morning came. And there was nothing." The old man smiled gently. "Still, every time I see that light, my heart believes for just one moment." The station clock struck 9. The sound echoed across the prairie. William slowly stood. "I should go home." Samuel watched him walk toward the dusty road. This time, however, he noticed something he had never seen before. William was no longer walking with the heavy steps of a man carrying endless sorrow. The letter had changed something inside him. For the first time in many years, he no longer wondered whether Edward had forgotten him. Now he knew the truth. His son had kept his promise in his heart until the very end. The next morning, Samuel could not stop thinking about the mysterious light. After finishing his duties, he decided to travel to the county records office in the nearest town. The journey took nearly 3 hours by horse. The courthouse was an old brick building filled with shelves of dusty documents. An elderly clerk greeted him politely. "Can I help you?" Samuel removed the folded letter from his coat. "I'm searching for information about a railroad passenger." The clerk adjusted his spectacles. "What was his name?" "Edward Harris." The old clerk became strangely quiet. He slowly walked toward a cabinet that had not been opened for years. After searching for several minutes, he returned carrying a thick leather file. He gently placed it on the wooden desk. "I remember hearing this name when I was a young apprentice," he said softly. "It was considered one of the saddest stories on this railroad." Samuel's heart began to race. He carefully opened the file. Inside lay faded newspaper clippings, railway reports, and several handwritten witness statements. One headline immediately caught his attention. "Westbound train delayed after mountain blizzard, several passengers missing." The date, December 1867. Samuel turned another page, then another, until he found a list of passengers. Halfway down the page, there it was, Edward Harris. Beside his name, someone had written just 3 words, "Never officially found." Samuel stared at the page. A chill ran through him. Edward had not abandoned his father. He had disappeared. But how? And why had no one from the railroad ever explained what had happened? As Samuel closed the file, something small. Part 6. Samuel carefully lifted the old photograph from the desk. The edges were worn, and a faint crack ran across one corner. Even so, the faces were surprisingly clear. There were 12 railroad workers standing beside a steam locomotive almost completely buried beneath heavy snow. Some of them smiled proudly at the camera. Others looked tired after what must have been days of difficult work. Near the back stood a young man with kind eyes and a confident smile. His right hand rested on a silver pocket watch. There was no doubt. It was Edward Harris. Samuel looked toward the elderly clerk. Where did this photograph come from? The clerk adjusted his spectacles and thought for a moment. It was taken in the Rocky Mountains during the winter of 1867, he replied. A freight train became trapped after one of the worst snowstorms anyone could remember. Several passengers and railroad workers volunteered to help rescue the people on board. Samuel listened carefully. And Edward was one of them. The old clerk nodded. Yes. According to the reports, he was not even supposed to be there. He had simply been traveling west. But when he heard that families, children, and elderly passengers were stranded in the mountains, he stepped forward without hesitation. Samuel lowered his eyes to the photograph again. It was difficult to imagine the quiet young man leaving the warmth of the train to face a freezing blizzard. The clerk continued. The rescue lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Snow covered the tracks faster than men could clear them. Food became scarce. Temperatures fell far below freezing. He paused. Many people survived because a few brave volunteers refused to give up. Samuel slowly asked, "Was Edward one of those volunteers?" The old man smiled gently. According to every witness, yes. Samuel remained silent. Outside the courthouse window, the afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky. The golden light filled the room with warmth, but the story carried him into a world of ice, snow, and bitter winds. The clerk opened another folder. Inside was the handwritten diary of a railroad engineer named Benjamin Cole. The pages had faded with time, but one passage remained easy to read. Samuel began reading aloud. December 18th, 1867. Young Edward Harris worked longer than any man among us. When others rested, he carried blankets to frighten children. When food ran low, he gave away his own share without complaint. I asked him why he pushed himself so hard. He smiled and answered, "Because my father is waiting for me. If I save these people first, perhaps someone would do the same for him one day." Samuel stopped reading. Neither he nor the clerk spoke for several moments. The words lingered in the quiet room. Edward had never forgotten his promise. Even in the middle of a deadly storm, he had been thinking about his father. Samuel carefully turned the page. The next diary entry was shorter. Its handwriting shook slightly, as if it had been written with freezing hands. December 20th. The storm has become impossible. Visibility is almost gone. Edward volunteered to walk toward the nearest signal cabin to send for additional help. He left before sunrise. We never saw him again. Samuel slowly closed the diary. The room felt very still. The mystery that had lasted 17 years was becoming clearer. Edward had not disappeared because he wanted a new life. He had disappeared while trying to save the lives of strangers. As Samuel thanked the old clerk and stepped outside, the evening air greeted him with a cool breeze. The journey back to Ash Creek would take hours, but his thoughts remained fixed on one question. If Edward had vanished in the mountains, then who, or what, had been whistling near the station every night? And why did that lonely sound always return when William came to wait? The answer, Samuel sensed, was still hidden SOM. Part 7. The following morning arrived with a pale golden sunrise. A gentle mist rested over the prairie, softening the endless fields of tall grass. The rails shimmered with tiny drops of dew, and the cool air carried the familiar scent of pine, earth, and fresh autumn leaves. Samuel Carter stood outside Ash Creek Station, holding a small canvas bag. Inside were a loaf of bread, a water flask, Edward Harris's letter, the old photograph, and a notebook. He had made a decision. If he wanted to understand what had happened 17 years ago, he would have to follow Edward's final journey. Just after sunrise, a freight train agreed to carry Samuel west toward the Rocky Mountains. The journey lasted nearly 2 days. As the train rolled across the American frontier, the landscape slowly changed. The wide prairies gave way to rolling hills. The hills became forests. The forests rose into towering mountains whose snowy peaks disappeared into the clouds. Samuel spent most of the journey sitting beside the window. He watched rivers sparkle beneath wooden bridges. He saw wild horses grazing peacefully in distant valleys. Tiny settlements appeared for only a few moments before disappearing behind the hills. The rhythm of the locomotive was steady and comforting. Click, clack, click, clack. It was easy to understand why so many travelers fell asleep during long railroad journeys. Late on the second afternoon, the train reached a small mountain station called Silver Pass. Only a handful of buildings stood there. The station master was an elderly woman named Martha Collins. She had worked on the railroad for almost 30 years. When Samuel mentioned Edward Harris, Martha became very quiet. She looked toward the mountains before speaking. "I remember hearing his name when I was a young clerk," she said softly. "My father never forgot him." Samuel's curiosity grew stronger. What happened here? Martha sighed. People always believed Edward disappeared. She paused. "But my father used to say, 'Some people are never truly lost.'" Those words stayed with Samuel. The next morning, Martha led him along an old trail climbing into the mountains. The path was narrow and covered with fallen pine needles. Birdsong echoed gently through the trees. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. After nearly 3 hours, they reached a lonely clearing. There, standing among tall pines, was a small wooden building. Its roof had partially collapsed. Its windows were broken. Its door hung loosely on rusty hinges. "This," Martha whispered, "was signal cabin number 12. Samuel stepped inside. Dust floated through beams of sunlight shining between the broken boards. An old cast-iron stove stood in one corner. A wooden desk remained beside the window. Everything looked exactly as if someone had simply walked away. On the desk rested a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked with age. Samuel carefully opened it. Most of the pages contained weather reports. Snow depth, wind direction, rail traffic. Then, near the final pages, he found one last entry. The handwriting was hurried but clear. December 20th, 1867. A young traveler reached the cabin just before sunset. His name is Edward Harris. He carried a message asking for immediate rescue. He was exhausted, freezing, and barely able to stand. Samuel read more slowly. After warming himself beside the stove, he insisted we send the telegraph before treating his injuries. He said the passengers must be rescued first. Samuel smiled quietly. Even after everything, Edward had still been thinking about others. He continued reading. The telegraph was sent successfully. Rescue teams have departed. The passengers should survive. Then came the final lines. The ink had faded badly. Some words were almost impossible to read. Samuel leaned closer. Edward asked me for one final favor. He handed him. Part 8. The mountain air was calm as Samuel and Martha stepped out of signal cabin number 12. The afternoon sun rested gently on the pine trees, and the sound of a distant stream echoed through the quiet valley. For a long moment, Samuel looked back at the old cabin. It had stood there for nearly 2 decades, guarding a story that almost no one remembered. Yet one question still remained. What were Edward Harris's final words to his father? Martha broke the silence. There may be one person who still knows. Samuel turned toward her. Who? The old telegraph operator. She smiled faintly. His name is Elijah Brooks. He lives alone about 5 miles from here. They say he hasn't visited the railroad in years. The two of them followed a narrow trail that wound through the forest. As they walked, the sunlight filtered through the tall pine branches, painting moving patterns across the ground. Birds sang softly overhead. The peaceful sounds of nature made it difficult to imagine the terrible snowstorm that had once covered these mountains. Nearly 2 hours later, they reached a small wooden cabin beside a clear stream. Thin smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. A gray-haired man sat quietly on the front porch, carving a piece of wood with a small pocket knife. He looked up as Samuel approached. Before Samuel could introduce himself, the old man smiled. "You came looking for Edward Harris, didn't you?" Samuel stopped in surprise. "How did you know?" Elijah chuckled softly. "Because no one visits an old telegraph operator unless they're chasing an old story." Samuel smiled. He took the faded letter from his coat and gently placed it on the porch table. Elijah's expression changed the moment he saw the handwriting. "I haven't seen this in 17 years, he whispered. He carefully unfolded the letter and read it once more. When he finished, he closed his eyes. I remember him clearly. He was exhausted. His hands were frozen. But he kept asking only one question." Samuel leaned forward. "What question?" Elijah looked toward the mountains. He kept asking, "Did the message get through?" Samuel remained silent. The rescue train left before sunrise. Elijah continued. "Because of Edward's courage, every passenger trapped in that blizzard was saved." A gentle breeze moved through the trees. The old man smiled sadly. "Most heroes are remembered. But Edward simply disappeared." Samuel hesitated. "Do you remember what he wanted to tell his father?" Elijah nodded slowly. "I remember every word." For several moments, he said nothing. Then, in a calm, gentle voice, he spoke exactly as Edward had spoken 17 years earlier. "If you ever meet my father, tell him I never broke my promise. Tell him that every step I took was leading me home. And if I cannot return with my own feet, may the sound of these railroad tracks remind him that my love never left." Samuel felt his eyes fill with tears. The words were simple, yet they carried a lifetime of love. Elijah stood and walked slowly inside his cabin. When he returned, he held a small wooden box. "I've kept this safe all these years." He handed it to Samuel. Inside was a brass railroad button, polished smooth with age. Beneath it lay a tiny folded note. Written in Edward's familiar handwriting were just 4 words. "Home was always you." Samuel closed the box with great care. He knew, at that moment, that William Harris deserved to hear every one of those words. The long journey back to Ash Creek was about to begin. And for the first time in 17 years, a father would finally receive the message his son had tried so hard to send. To be continued. Part 9. The journey back to Ash Creek Station felt quieter than the one that had carried Samuel west. The train moved steadily across the vast American landscape, passing snow-covered mountains, winding rivers, and endless fields that glowed beneath the gentle light of autumn. Samuel sat beside the window, holding the small wooden box Elijah Brooks had entrusted to him. Inside rested Edward Harris's brass railroad button. Beside it lay the tiny note with 4 unforgettable words. "Home was always you." During the long journey, Samuel thought often about William Harris. For 17 years, the old man had lived between hope and heartbreak. Every evening, he had walked the same dusty road. Every evening, he had watched the same railroad tracks. Not because he refused to accept the truth, but because love rarely follows reason. When the train finally reached Ash Creek, the sun was already beginning to sink below the western horizon. The familiar wooden station stood exactly as Samuel had left it. Its faded sign creaked softly in the evening wind. The lanterns had just been lit. Everything felt peaceful. Everything felt unchanged. Except Samuel himself. He carried answers now. As always, just before sunset, William Harris appeared on the distant road. His slow footsteps crossed the wooden platform one final time. He smiled gently when he saw Samuel waiting beside the northern bench. "You found something," William said quietly. Samuel nodded. "I found much more than I expected." The two men sat together in silence for several moments. The prairie stretched endlessly before them. A cool breeze whispered through the tall grass. Then Samuel carefully placed the wooden box into William's hands. The old man looked at it with trembling fingers. He opened the lid. Inside lay the brass railroad button. The moment he saw it, his eyes filled with tears. "I sewed this onto Edward's coat myself," he whispered. "He was only 22. He kept it all these years." Samuel reached into his coat and unfolded the final note. Without speaking, he handed it to William. The old man read the words slowly. "Home was always you." His hands began to shake. For a long time, he could not speak. At last, with tears quietly falling down his weathered face, he whispered, "I thought he had forgotten." Samuel gently shook his head. "No. He carried you with him every step of the way." William closed his eyes. The burden he had carried for 17 long years seemed to grow lighter with every passing moment. Samuel then removed Edward's letter and read aloud the final message Elijah Brooks had remembered. "Tell my father I never broke my promise. Every step I took was leading me home. If I cannot return with my own feet, may the sound of these railroad tracks remind him that my love never left." The evening wind carried the words across the empty prairie. William listened without moving. When Samuel finished reading, the old man smiled. Not the uncertain smile of hope, not the painful smile of longing, but the peaceful smile of a father who had finally found the answer he had waited nearly 2 decades to hear. "I don't think," William said softly, "I'll need to wait here every evening anymore." Samuel looked toward him. "Do you believe your son kept his promise?" William looked at the endless railroad stretching toward the western horizon. "I do. He came home. Not on a train, but through the hearts of the people he saved." The station clock struck 8. At that very moment, the familiar whistle echoed across the prairie once again. Long, gentle, peaceful. Samuel slowly stood. This time, he was not afraid. Neither was William. The old man simply removed his hat. He smiled toward the dark railroad tracks, and in a voice barely louder than the evening breeze, he whispered, "Thank you, my son." The whistle sounded once more, then slowly faded into. Part 10, Final Chapter. The next morning arrived with perfect stillness. A thin layer of golden sunlight spread across the prairie, touching the weathered roof of Ash Creek Station. The wooden platform, quiet as always, seemed almost unchanged. Yet something had changed. For the first time in 17 years, the northern bench was empty. Samuel Carter unlocked the station door and looked toward the place where William Harris had sat every evening. No brown coat, no black felt hat, no worn leather bag. Only the gentle wind moving through the tall prairie grass. Samuel smiled to himself. The waiting had finally come to an end. As the days turned into weeks, life at Ash Creek Station continued much as it always had. The morning train arrived on time. The afternoon freight train carried timber, wheat, and mail across the western frontier. The evening passenger train stopped for only a few quiet minutes before disappearing into the darkness. But the people of Ash Creek slowly noticed something. William Harris no longer came to the station. Instead, every Sunday afternoon, he walked to the small white church on the hill overlooking the railroad. There, beneath a young oak tree, he would quietly read Edward's letter once again. He no longer searched the tracks. He no longer counted the passing trains. His heart had finally found peace. One crisp autumn afternoon, Samuel visited William's small farmhouse. The old man welcomed him warmly. His home was simple but comfortable. Above the fireplace hung a framed photograph of a young man with kind eyes. Edward Harris. On the mantel rested the silver pocket watch. It was still ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Samuel smiled. You still wind it every morning. William nodded gently. Yes, but not because I'm waiting. He looked toward the photograph. I keep it running because every second reminds me how precious our time together was. The two men shared tea as the afternoon sunlight slowly filled the little room. Before Samuel left, William handed him the brass railroad button. I think this belongs at the station, he said, so that everyone who passes through Ash Creek will remember that ordinary people can live extraordinary lives. Samuel accepted the gift with great respect. The following week, the railroad company placed the button inside a small glass case in the station waiting room. Beside it was a simple brass plaque. It read, Edward Harris, traveler, volunteer, son. He kept his promise. Years passed. Steam locomotives became faster. New towns appeared. Children grew into adults. Many of the people who had once known Edward Harris were gone. But travelers who stopped at Ash Creek often paused to read the small plaque. Some smiled. Some quietly removed their hats. Others simply stood for a moment, imagining the young man who had crossed a frozen mountain to save strangers, and never stopped loving his father. William Harris lived peacefully for several more years. On many evenings, he would sit on the porch of his farmhouse and listen as distant trains echoed across the prairie. Whenever he heard a whistle, he would close his eyes and smile. Not because he believed Edward was returning, but because every whistle reminded him of a promise that had never been broken. One winter morning, William passed away peacefully in his sleep. He held Edward's final letter gently in his hands. The people of Ash Creek buried him beside his wife, beneath the old oak tree overlooking the railroad. The silver pocket watch was placed beside him. Its hands had finally stopped, not because no one remembered to wind it, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. Many years later, an elderly station master told the story of William and Edward to every young railway worker who came to Ash Creek. He always ended with the same words. Railroads carry people across great distances, but love travels even farther. And sometimes, the longest journey